And all of these factors are going to have quite an effect on the speed of approach of the task group.
So that's why we're talking about 3 weeks now. And of course, we go down, don't we, to the Roaring Forties?
Yes, indeed. To the lands, or the waters, shall we say, that traditionally we had a South Atlantic squadron used to look after this area. It was very nice for the ships visiting South Africa and things, but they were there on site in case things went wrong in the South Atlantic.
Well, now things have gone wrong. It would have been rather nice to have had a South Atlantic squadron, wouldn't it, over the past week or so?
Yes, I'm afraid that very often with the British it's a case of too little too late.
Now, when Hermes comes out, which we shall see in, I suppose, about 20 minutes' time, she has to lie off Plymouth later in the day to take on some Marines. How does that operation work?
Well, I imagine that the Marines will be brought aboard, ferried aboard both by boat and by aircraft. Of course, essential is speed, and hopefully the weather conditions will be nice spring weather for the embarkation of Plymouth.
I was talking to a group of officers who were sailing today, talking to them last night. They had been told not to expect too much comfort on this trip because every single one of these ships is absolutely jammed. In fact, the official description of their cabins and whatnot is arduous conditions. Now, what does that mean?
Well, the cabins are used by the officers are, of course, rather small, even for one person, and you'll find that there'll be two people in these cabins. When one is standing up, the other one really ought to be lying down. There is very, very little manoeuvring space. And, of course, with a vessel like HMS Fearless, a landing ship dock, you must remember that it looks rather large, such a vessel, but a large part of the ship is the floating dock area. So you've got a lot of people crowded into a very small space. I think with the Royal Navy, it's usually a question is stow thick and grow lousy.
Yes, in terms of conditions, I imagine the Marines come off perhaps worst because they really are crammed in, aren't they, on a ship like Fearless, for example?
Oh, yes, indeed. And as I say, you know, stow thick and grow lousy is really the order of the day for Royal Marines and Royal Navy. It's a situation that traditionally I think we're rather used to.
But this doesn't actually help your feelings if you're having a fairly rotten journey for 3 weeks down into the South Atlantic, facing what they may face. They presumably don't feel all that cheerful about that sort of thing, do they?
Well, I think there's the excitement of being in this task group, which in itself is quite an honor for these volunteer men who form the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines.
Now I can see this is Pearleaf, HMS Pearleaf, the supply ship which will sail somewhere around 11:15. She goes after Hermes. And she is obviously one of the very many supply ships, but she is the only one going out this morning, and she will tag along behind Invincible and Hermes. And her job is the rather less glamorous one, but equally vital one, of oiling and keeping supplied this fleet, because this fleet does require, Peter, tremendous backup, does it not?
Yes, it does indeed. Those who remember World War II will, of course, remember with our Pacific Fleet, the large fleet train that we had, ships capable of supplying ammunition, fuel, general stores, even beer.
Oh, there goes the Mayor of Portsmouth. He's done his job for the day, which was to say farewell to Invincible. Who else is on there, Peter, did you see?
The Commander-in-Chief of the Naval Home Command. It is his barge, you see, and the Lord Mayor, as the civic dignitary of Portsmouth, accompanied him.
I beg his pardon. I thought it might be the Mayor's. Obviously, it's not. Does this traditionally happen when a fleet sails, that the Commander-in-Chief sails out in his barge?
Well, of course, these days you don't too often get a situation of a fleet sailing. Very often it's the Queen's Harbour Master's barge that leads the way. But of course today is a special occasion with this task group, so it was the Commander-in-Chief of the Naval Home Command himself who led the way out of the harbour. When
did a fleet last sail from Portsmouth?
Oh dear. I'm afraid off the top of my head I can't say when that was.
Are we talking about the Second World War, is it?
Well, there have been since then the occasions of Fleet Review in 1977 and such joyous events as that. But on a war footing, of course, we must go back, I think, to the preparations for Suez.
Well, certainly the instructions handed out to the correspondents travelling with the fleet on this occasion, I noticed last night, were dated 1958. They were issued immediately after Suez. And are just a little bit dog-eared because the people in the Ministry of Defence at first couldn't find them. They were buried in the basement somewhere, simply because this hasn't happened.
Of course, one of the big things facing the task group is the 3 weeks heading south. It does give them a chance to settle down within the ships, to exercise, to understand and get used to living with each other. And of course, it enables the captains of ships to get used to each other's minds and the way they tend to behave. All useful stuff for us as well as for the opposition.
In the course of a journey like this, is it possible to carry out any operational training?
Oh yes, there would be quite a lot of operational training. This involves the helicopters and the aircraft, and of course, if the weather conditions are good, then such valuable things as lowering landing craft, such maneuvers as that can be carried out, which will all help towards improving the ultimate requirement, which is absolute essential teamwork. I do notice now going into the harbour is the barge of the Queen's Harbour Master, and you see the Queen's Harbour Master flag flying.
So what we wait for next is HMS Hermes to slip her moorings and come past us. And while we wait for that, let's go back to the studio and to Michael Brunson.
So we see Invincible there underway, but the big question, of course, is what are the tactics that are going to be used once she arrives at her ultimate destination? What is she actually going to do? Well, to discuss that, we have Rear Admiral Gerritz and Geoffrey Archer, our defence correspondent.
Admiral Gerritz, this is a very large force. In addition to Invincible and Hermes that we're seeing today, what are the other types of ships that are going to be part of the force?
My understanding is that we should expect several Type 42 class ships, and with them also it's been suggested that there would be some Type 22s, and finally the backbone of the fleet frigate force, the Leander class, will be represented.
And what are the different roles of these different types of ships?
The Leander class has provided a general purpose capability, but the Type 42 has a fine surface-to-air guided weapon, and that is the role which it will primarily prepare for. And the Type 22 has a good anti-submarine warfare capability with 2 helicopters to help with the task.
So we've got elements of anti-ship, anti-air and anti-submarine, is that right?
That's the basic fact thing. There was the possibility of counter-class ships being represented, and I wait to hear whether this is confirmed or not. They are, of course, the older version of the guided weapon ships, which have been in service in the Far East and other places over a period of some years. You'll recall that they were well to the fore in the confrontation in 65, 66, to which Peter Whitlock was referring down at Portsmouth just now.
Now, we've seen Invincible, a very crowded-looking ship. She's got 8 Sea Harriers on board instead of her usual complement of 5, and presumably some extra Sea-King helicopters for landing the Royal Marines. How difficult is it going to be in such a crowded ship to keep up the fitness of the men who may have to go into action 8,000 miles of sea later?
Well, I think that the experience which we've had in carrier operations over a period of years will have accustomed people to maintaining their skills and fitness in the sort of operations that you have in mind in the Invincible and in Hermes. But where difficulties may arise is when one's concerned with the physical fitness of Royal Marines. Wartime experience confirmed the difficulties of keeping people in tip-top shape when necessarily they were crowded in so that the maximum number of men could be landed at a given time. And this is one of the problems which will be exercising the force commander's mind and his landing force advisors. So every effort will be made to give the Royal Marines as much exercise as possible. One has to remember the changes in climate which are going to be experienced. At one moment they'll be having a nice, fresh European spring weather, and the next thing we'll be down in the equator, and then heading south again into colder weather. Now, when they're in the tropics, it may be pretty uncomfortable. I've been in a ship there where we had 700 extra survivors on board in addition to the ship's company. It's pretty rough, as Peter Whitlock was saying. Camp beds lying everywhere, hammocks slung in every conceivable position, and that's what it'll be like, I suspect, in this passage that's now beginning.
What can they do? What can they do to keep fit? Is it just a matter of running up and down the decks all the way?
Well, I think that probably the situation won't be quite as grave as it was in one ship where we had a Highland regiment on board and we had bagpipes playing for 8 hours a day while the troops marched around the decks. But no, they'll do the best they can to have some movement of the body for all the men every day. And also, of course, there is the matter of keeping fit in the matter of not getting over sunburned, and at the same time not getting skin diseases through the crowded conditions.
There's been a lot of talk about what this force is going to do when it gets to its destination. Can we just clarify one thing? As far as a balance of naval forces is concerned, presumably there's no doubt that Britain would win a sea battle there against Argentina.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. You could hardly expect a British admiral to sit here and say anything else. Particularly when chaps are talking about armadas in the way they were, although I think it's an unfortunate title to have chosen, observing what the fate of the armada was. But in any case, the quality of our ships is very high, and as Mr. Knott has emphasized, of course, we're talking about an all-volunteer force. But there is one aspect of it which has to be considered, and that is that one or two of the ships that the Argentine Navy has are similar to those, if not the same, as ones that we have, and a number of their officers and men have had training in this country. And it's a sad aspect of this situation that old friendships are being broken apart by what has happened.
Now, shortly we hope to see HMS Hermes starting to turn in the harbour. She's an old ship. Does that make her not such a valuable one for this sort of force?
No, I don't think that needs to come into our calculations. One of the aspects of an old ship is that she's not purpose-built for all the tasks she now has to do, and therefore, to some extent, she may have uneconomical aspects. She was built, as you know, as a member of the fleet carrier force rather than as a commando ship or an anti-submarine vessel. But apart from those factors, she is a workmanlike component of the fleet and will perform a useful service in several different roles if need be. She didn't come into service until about 1959, as far as I remember, and has had varied service, of course, because she was a commando ship at one time.
Well, we think we're just seeing pictures of Hermes, and we'll pass you back to Anthony Carthew in Portsmouth.
Yes, Hermes is shortly leaving. Well, she's actually on her way, and she'll be coming past us, I suppose, in a few minutes' time. She's the old lady of the fleet. This is the ship that there was some doubt about overnight. In fact, even at 9 o'clock this morning, they were saying no way she will sail. But in fact, they have worked amazingly hard to get one engine back in commission, and it is in commission, and she is sailing. On board Hermes, you may like to know, is Michael Nicholson of ITN. The press are slightly dispersed around the fleet itself, and the television crews were originally on Invincible until late last night, when a decision came from Downing Street that television should be removed to Hermes, and the writing press, the newspapers, put on Invincible. We understand that that was in fact Mrs. Thatcher's decision. She seemed to prefer to have the writing press closer to the admirals. It is nothing to do with Prince Andrew being on board Invincible. In fact, the palace are perfectly happy to allow pictures of him going about his duties. It is entirely a political decision. There were a few ruffled feathers as a result of this decision, but okay, it's something we have to live with. And so therefore, on board Hermes now are the television crews who will be satelliting pictures back of this extraordinary journey. And that also has not been done before either. So that could be quite interesting in its own right. Hermes itself really was up for the chop. She was up for disposal, and in fact of all people, the Chilean Navy were showing an interest. But she's not been sold, and therefore she's earned a reprieve in what you might call a fairly spectacular way. Can you tell me, Peter, what about Hermes? Is she likely to kind of limp along with the rest of them, or can she cope?
No, I think that these are very hardy ships. They've been running some time. I served in a sister ship, the Centaur, of course, slightly different category because she was equipped with Sea Vixen, was very much the aircraft carrier, whereas now, of course, it is very much the commando carrier with its helicopters. But they are robust vessels, even though they're getting on in years. Well-tried fighting machines, I think, might be a suitable expression.
So we shouldn't feel too sorry for her then. She, in fact, she still looks pretty trim anyway. If, while she's approaching us, I could tell you a little bit about this journey. It takes 3 weeks for the simple reason that it goes an awful long way. Now, what happens is that from here, the Invincible and Hermes and company will rendezvous with the Marines off Plymouth. Then off they go. Their next rendezvous is off the Azores. There they'll meet the Mediterranean fleet, which has been formed for this mission. And when they do, they will be complete. These are the flagships we're seeing going today. But when they get there, they will be met by the really upmarket escort, which is led by some county-class guided missile destroyers, Glamorgan and Antrim. Now, Antrim I know a little bit about, having been on her for a spell during a gunnery exercise, which certainly put the fear of God into me as an appalling noise. But I'm sure we were at that stage, we were in fact shelling an uninhabited island. At least at the time we thought it was uninhabited. But the kind of noise, the kind of firepower that these things have got is absolutely incredible. Now, with Glamorgan and Antrim, we shall also have the destroyers Sheffield, Coventry and Glasgow. They come out alongside Antrim and Glamorgan. And then after that, we get the frigates, the workhorses, these speedy little things, which we in television tend to remember rather well from the Cod War days. They are extraordinary vessels to live and work in. 250 men crammed together. The sardine can image is entirely true. One of the worrying things about frigates is that they are fast, and because they're fast, they're very lightly built. And they only have, for example, their plates are only 3/8 of an inch thick, which means that very small things can penetrate and cause problems. So they are the workhorses, the fast riders of this kind of operation. Slightly difficult to serve in because they really are crammed, even more so, I think, probably than the big ships. Then, okay, after that you get the submarines. They all join up together, and they go down then towards the Ascension Islands. Now, there they will rendezvous for the last time before they set off for the Falklands. And when they do that, what will happen is that they will check out the feasibility of air operations based on the Ascension Islands. This brings in the RAF and the C-130 Hercules. At this stage, we don't really know whether it's possible to use them as a ferrying thing. The distance is still 3,500 miles, which is pushing the range of a Hercules. The range of a Hercules is something over 4,000 miles, but you do need refueling capabilities, and that is not an easy part of the world to refuel in. In addition to that, of course, the weather, as we now enter a South Atlantic winter, just the beginning of that period, is not going to help in any way. So that is the route which this great fleet will take when it's all gathered together. That is the thing which has been set in motion today by the departure of Invincible, and now Hermes going out to join her. We're still actually waiting now for her to come past our position. She is, understandably, a little slower than was Invincible. Peter, can I ask you now just how experienced would be a captain of a ship like Hermes, okay, knowing all the theory, but not a great deal of the practice?
Well, the Navy has always been very careful that the captains of her ships have considerable experience in handling these vessels under varying weather conditions. It's true to say that, of course, there hasn't been the sea time that you might expect people to have in time of war, but nevertheless, the Navy has paid great attention to this particular aspect.
Of course, training is a marvelous thing, and I'm sure the Navy training is excellent, but it is no substitute, and therefore, anyone commanding this kind of operation must have a few apprehensions about the way people will behave coming into possible action for the first time.
Oh yes, very true, because of the, as I think was mentioned earlier, some of these men are very young, but we've managed conditions like that before and come out very credibly. You can see now, I think, quite clearly the Hermes as she moves. She is still making sternway, as you can see, and will be turning shortly to come to line up for the approach to the narrow entrance to the harbour where we are.
Because this is, in fact, a very, very narrow entrance. It must cause great problems for the bigger ships, because, I mean, across here is really quite narrow, isn't it?
Oh, yes, it is. I mean, its width is less than the length of the Hermes. If she was broadside on, she would well and truly block the entrance.
So the tide, therefore, must, I mean, apart from the width of the thing, the tide must be pretty crucial in its own right.
Oh, yes, and of course the vessel cannot proceed too fast through the entrance, otherwise you'd start to destroy all the seawork defences that protect the sides of the harbour. So she has to come fairly slow, but just enough speed for manoeuvrability. But of course, the attendant tugs are fairly close at hand to deal with any particular problem, to give a nudge if things do go wrong.
I noticed that Invincible slipped her tugs quite early in the game. I mean, some quarter of a mile down before the exit. Is this because you cannot get ship and tugs through at the same time?
Well, you could, but it would be a pretty tight squeeze. And you've got suitable weather conditions, therefore a captain is obviously quite happy to handle his ship under his own power.
So in the traditional phrase, they've got a lovely day for it.
Yes, indeed. It's very good conditions.
And now, while we're waiting for Hermes to come past our position, let's go back to the studio.
Now, Admiral Goeritz, what are the problems going to be in supporting this size of fleet, this enormous distance away from Britain? 8,000 miles away, 30-plus ships. What are the problems in support?
Well, I'm particularly conscious of this series of problems which you've raised, because I was concerned with the logistic support of the force that we used at Suez, and the conditions there were considerably easier than we're confronting now, because we had a fairly substantial logistic support force available. With the distances that were involved were considerably less, and we had a number of intermediate bases. The two primary problems which confront us are the number of support vessels that will be required to maintain a reasonable supply line of fuel and other commodities, and the distance which those ships in turn will have to go to a point at which they themselves can be replenished.
Well,
and therefore,
if I may interrupt,
yeah.
With a fleet that has been getting smaller over the years, have we got enough support ships to keep them going?
Well, I haven't done any calculations this morning, but there is no doubt that in the course of years we've disposed of one element that used to be available as a reserve. We used to have more tankers than we required, and we chartered them out, and they turned an honest coin for the Queen, doing ordinary commercial transactions. But we had the right to call on them whenever we needed them, and we did just that for Suez. Now, I've no doubt that in the Ministry of Defence today there will be busy people in the Directors of Stores Department trying to arrange for charter, if need be, of extra vessels to help to support those specially equipped ships which are needed for the support of the fleet at sea.
Now, about halfway through their sea journey is Ascension Island. What value is that island going to be in the fleet support?
The facilities there are primarily those of air supply and communications. If there were some commodities required, they could be flown to Ascension and be ferried off by helicopter or appropriate means to the ships at sea. But that's the crux of that part of the problem. Personnel could be exchanged, additional stores of anything that's required unexpectedly. That would be the point of Ascension.
What about fuel? How far would they have to go for fuel? Would they have to go back to the UK, or could they get some in Africa, perhaps?
Well, I suppose that Gibraltar is one possibility before you get to the UK. But again, it depends so much on the relationships which will exist diplomatically with countries such as Sierra Leone, which might be one point of contact which is on the list. And, of course, the delicate matter to which Mr. Eldon Griffiths referred to today, the relationships with South Africa, because there is a point at which materials of all kinds are available, and on the other hand, highly explosive diplomatic problems which arise if we were to have access to those resources. South Africa has other things as well. Of course, it has all the facilities of dry docks and repairs that might be required if an operation lasted a considerable period.
Turning to what they're likely to do when they get there, Anthony Carthew was mentioning the possibility of air operations from Ascension Island. Do you think there'd be any possibility of air support unless the Royal Navy had already managed to capture and secure the airstrip on the Falklands?
I can't see any possibility of air support except of the longest range bomber type, including some form of in-flight refueling. If you're referring to close support of any kind by fighters or in the ground attack role, no, this would be a matter for the integral air power that's with the fleet.
But what about any troop support? I mean, parachutists, for example. Would they need, would the aircraft that dropped them then have to land on the Falklands? In other words, would that runway have to be secure first?
This is my supposition. The whole problem of the parachute operation, which has been, I think, rather lightly tossed around, I'm sure is exercising people's minds a great deal at the moment. You have another problem there. We mentioned the difficulties of maintaining fitness in the ships. Well, if you have a parachute force being carried too far, the fitness of the men falls off extremely sharply, and then their fighting efficiency is substantially reduced at the other end. This is just another of the many problems that you need to do with your measuring, with your parallel ruler and dividers when you're working out this problem.
So at the moment it looks as if it's going to be all down to the Navy when they get there.
That is my supposition at the moment. The recall of the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, I'm sure, is the one that sparked off this. Now, the other possibility, of course, is they are a fine regiment. It might have been thought that they would be the appropriate reinforcement for any Royal Marine landing force that was sent, and they could, of course, be conveyed by sea. Again, a casual report I heard today was that there might be the possibility of chartering a ship. Well, now, you may know that there are ships used on educational cruises, which would be ideal for this purpose, for moving troops.
If you were the Admiral in charge of this fleet, what would your feelings be today, setting off for the other side of the world, quite unsure of what the military situation is going to be when you get there?
Well, I'm sure that I'd be expected to make some pompous pronouncement about it being a great honor. Well, undoubtedly it would be. I'm sure that the first feeling that Admiral Woodward has if he is on his bridge at the moment would be of singular privilege, and the other is extremely heavy responsibility that's going to lie on his shoulders from the moment that the force starts to form up.
Admiral, I wonder if I could ask you perhaps to put yourself in the shoes of the Argentinian Admiral, who later on tonight will be watching these sort of pictures on television. Now, what do you think his reaction is going to be? Is he going to be alarmed by what he sees, or is he going to say to himself, I have got ships, I have got aircraft at my disposal which can match this, that it's going to be a fair fight?
When I knew I was coming on this program, I spent a few minutes at the midnight hour worrying about what was to happen, and one of the things I concluded was that I must be at singular pains to make sure that I give no comfort to the Admiral you've asked me to impersonate for a few minutes. I want to give him no comfort, and I want to give him no useful information. Most of the information which we're bandying about at the moment is readily available in any textbook, and as I said, some of his officers may well have been trained in England with our own officers in these same matters. I think that if I were in his shoes, I would be wondering how I could conduct perhaps apply the policy of the fleet in being and keep myself out of the way, because there is no doubt that we have some fine ships going down, and they will be operated by fine officers and men. And I think that if I were the Argentinian admiral, I would have some cause for concern.
Of course, presumably, we've seen all this extent of armament on board. We can see the pictures there. There are the helicopters quite plainly visible. We've seen also the Sea Harriers. A tremendous element of surprise presumably comes into this. Both commanders will be wanting to try and catch the other unawares.
Well, the whole history of the Southern Ocean is one of the difficulty of locating the precise position of raiders and hunting forces. We are going to an area in which Admiral Graf Spee surprised one a British squadron in the Pacific and then met his own fate off the Falkland Islands, and the ship that bore his name was then destroyed by its own crew off the River Plate as a result of an elaborate hunt that had gone on. Today we have, of course, new means of finding and identifying ships. Whether those will be available to the Argentinian forces is another matter. But it's the vast distances of the Southern Oceans and, of course, the very rough climatic conditions that they'll have to contend with.
We see there still Hermes making her way. Anthony Carthew from Portsmouth, can you give us some more information?
Yes, you see Hermes indeed. She's now bow on and in the channel. See something, I suppose, approaching a quarter of a mile from the exit of the harbour. Captain Lindley Middleton is in command. You see there the Sea King helicopters. Now, the interesting thing about those is that they are commando-carrying helicopters. These are the ones that would spearhead any landing that was required. She also has, which I think are out of sight at the moment, down below, 8 Harriers on board, the jump jets. Now, the interesting thing about that is that she is, in fact, a little bit overloaded, because there should only really be 5 or 6, but there are 8 on board. They've been crammed in somehow or other, and so she is carrying really a lot of hardware. Peter, that looks pretty crowded.
Yes, it does indeed. It certainly looks like a war situation, doesn't it? With the helicopters showing up clearly, and the men taking up their traditional positions, manning the side of the ship as she leaves harbour. And you can see the lead tug still in position. Hermes is now well pointed for the entrance and is gathering speed.
So there she goes, being mothered and fussed towards the harbour entrance. She, in some ways, I know she's a lot older, but she in some ways looks a rather more serious and menacing vessel than Invincible.
Well, I think it's psychological. Most of us have grown up over a period when this is what a warship looked like, whereas today they do look rather strange to most of us.
I thought at the time as I asked the question I was sounding like an old gentleman again. You're quite right. But in fact, they really are packed on that deck, aren't they, those choppers?
Yes, indeed. And you can see in the foreground the jump jets.
And those are the Harriers which presumably they've had to stow away like that. And that's a considerable parking feat apart from anything else, isn't it?
Oh yes, it's very, very difficult, clever manoeuvring to put aircraft into position on a flight deck at any time. And as she comes closer now, you can really see how crowded the decks are. The bow tug is still holding on. It's the Bustler, and she's now pointing nice and straight for the entrance.
So, as she approaches it, she is now making how many knots?
Oh, she's probably going at about 9 knots.
And that's about as fast as is practicable in this kind of narrow exit, is it, at Portsmouth?
Yes, that is correct. You can see, of course, the speed with which she's been got ready, because the ship's side doesn't look the neat grey that one would normally associate with one of Her Majesty's ships.
Well, certainly, if you'd seen her in say 2 days ago with all the scaffolding, you'd have thought it was never, ever possible to move her at all, but they've done it. And here she goes now, an impressive sight. Just the sort of thing which might be interesting on Argentine television to see this evening. I see one thing, Peter, they didn't actually manage to do much to the paintwork in the town.
No.
It does look really rather tatty to begin with, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Which, of course, must be very upsetting to the commander and the first lieutenant of the ship. The paintwork is their outward visible symbol of how good they are in their jobs.
But we are in exceptional circumstances. And there is a kind of armada going with Hermes. I've just been told, in fact, that Hermes is, in fact, even more overloaded than I'd said. There are 12 Harriers on board instead of the normal complement of 5 or 6. So she's doubled up. And then in this slight breeze, the white ensign blowing away and escort both in the air and boats. The Navy seems to allow a number of people to tag along behind in boats. I thought that was against the rules, but there's a yacht and a small boat chugging after her.
Yes, it is rather a special occasion. And as you referred to the white ensign, of course, it will change from that position very soon and be flown at the mast just abaft the funnel. That's very much the leaving harbour and in-harbour position for the white ensign.
And now, at this stage, there goes Hermes to follow Invincible. It's all happening here. We wish them Godspeed.
The scenes from Portsmouth this morning. There'll be many developments during the day. And in News at 10 tonight, we shall have a special extended interview with the Prime Minister. She'll be talking to our political editor, Glyn Mathias, as the fleet begins its 8,000-mile journey towards the Falkland Islands. From ITN, good morning.